me feel it, you? You get me, me, got you. You get me, can me feel it, you? You get me, me.
Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for engaging conversations about the topics that matter most in our culture. If you love nuance, if you want to better understand different points of view, if you're tired of the screamers taking all the oxygen out of the room, if you'll enjoy edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me, you love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other, where we get to talk to all kinds of interesting folks of goodwill and good faith about all kinds of interesting stuff. And if you dig that kind of thing, consider becoming a subscriber through Patreon to support what we're doing here and join our community. Become a part of the conversation, and we'll have more information about that in the coming weeks. I am your host, and I am so pleased to welcome our guest, Matt Lewis. Matt is a senior columnist for the Daily Beast, and his work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, GQ, the Washington Post, and a diverse array of other publications from across the spectrum. He previously served as senior contributor for the Daily Caller, and before that, as a columnist for AOL's Politics Daily. He also dissects the day's issues and conversations with other thinkers, authors, and newsmakers on his podcast, Matt Lewis and the News. You could also see Matt as a regular contributor on MSNBC, CNN, C-SPAN, PBS NewsHour, ABC's Nightline, HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, and CBS News' Face the Nation. And Matt's 2016 book, Too Dumb to Fail, How the GOP Went from the Party of Reagan to the Party of Trump, is a really enlightening read. Matt K. Lewis, thank you so much for joining us. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great.
I really appreciate you taking the time. This is a real treat for me, especially since the last time we talked. I've just been diving into old columns, your book, obviously, the collection you edited. But I want to start at the beginning. I'm imagining a young Matt Lewis growing up in rural Western Maryland. And when little Matt did something naughty, got in trouble, did your dad ever roll out with, what we have here is a failure to communicate?
I don't think my parents ever saw that movie.
Okay.
They would have viewed that movie as liberal Hollywood, atheist Hollywood. But they very well might have had that accent.
Yeah. Well, in all seriousness, I would love for you to give us a little background about your family, where you grew up, and some of those formative experiences.
Yeah, so I'm from Western Maryland, between Frederick and Hagerstown, Maryland, and my mom was like she was a homemaker for a while. She was a babysitter for a while, and amazingly, she actually edited books. Was like a proofreader, like a proofreader at Doubleday Book Company in Smithsburg, Maryland, of all places. Maybe that's where I get the writing thing from, my mom. My dad was a prison guard for about 30 years in Hagerstown, Maryland. He was a big, tough dude from the country, but he also was a dreamer. He's the guy, he paid me to read Dale Carnegie books when I was little. And he was also, I think that came from him, he was also a life insurance salesman.
Oh.
So he sold life insurance on the side. And of course, he also sold Amway too. And, at some point that fizzled. But I think all those things, combined and, make you who you are, all those experiences. And one of my first memories is my dad taking me to the polls in like 1980. And it was my elementary school, Wolfsville Elementary in Maryland, to vote for Ronald Reagan for the first time. And that's one of my first memories. So, it's no matter how old you get, those things really have lasting importance.
That's funny you mentioned that, because one of my earliest memories, we still lived in New York City, and it was the 76. I'm probably about 4 or 5 years older than you. And it was the 76 election, and we walked across the street to PS 19. My dad took me inside those curtains and that, and he voted for Jimmy Carter that year. So that, differences.
I think my mom kind of liked Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
I think she voted Reagan too. But you know, Carter was, you know, people forget, but Carter was sort of conservative. He was a Christian. He was a Southerner, and so I think that certainly in '76, there was a lot of hope in Carter.
Yeah.
That maybe by the time 1980 rolled around, some people had abandoned.
Well, one of the things I really appreciated about Too Dumb to Fail is that whole section where you track with the conservative movement and how it evolved. And one of those parts was when there were longtime Democrats that were kind of switching over to Republicans. And that was a pretty critical time, the late 70s into the early 80s, when Reagan finally consolidated a lot of that block. Or before that, you also talk about the Southern strategy.
Yeah.
But I had another question about your youth. I came across this song, "I Can Survive Because of You." Now, were you guys going for a whole Blues Traveler vibe? Because the harmonica, the singer even sounds like John Parker.
You have done your research. I've been doing this for a long time, and I don't think anyone has ever asked me about this before. We weren't really necessarily going for Blues Traveler, but I think we got there. We had a blues harp player named David Lance, who was phenomenal. And we had a lead singer and a rhythm guitar player named George Spiegel, who was a great songwriter. His brother, Mike Spiegel, was an amazing lead guitarist. And then my cousin Ronnie Beidle plays drums. Everyone could go listen to this on YouTube if they want. That song, the thing that makes that song, the reason I like that song is I was normally the bass player in that band, but in this particular song, I play the lead guitar, which is really like a faux steel guitar. Okay. So it's got a real twangy country sound, and me and the harmonica player kind of twin and go back and forth, taking turn playing lead. So that's one of my favorite songs. So inadvertently, we did sound a lot like Blues Traveler, though.
Yeah. Even the singer sounds a little bit like John Popper. I happened to grow up a couple towns away from those guys, and when they were first coming into their own, they were playing high school keggers, and then eventually the Rutgers and Princeton parties, and it was really cool to see them advance and have a real influence. But your harp player really nailed that cross harp.
He's good.
Thing. Yeah,
we actually did. I mean, we played Runaround, the Blues Traveler song, as a cover.
Okay.
And I wish we would have done Hook. I love that song Hook off that same album. But
it's a great jam.
Yeah. So that was a really interesting time in my life. And I wrote a piece later in the Daily Caller about how a lot of the stuff I learned playing in rock bands really applies to my life now in politics.
Oh, okay.
Which is weird, right? I always figured like my parents really thought that I was a loser, like living in their basement, playing in bands, doing God knows what. And they thought it would never come in handy, but it turns out it actually did.
So how does adventures as a musician prepare you for your career as a writer and a commentator on politics?
Some of it is just the writing, right? So like I was the collaboration. When you're in a rock band, you're like married to 4 dudes and you collaborate with writing. And honestly, that's what my writing is like now. Like my name may be on the byline, but it is a collaborative process, both with my formal editors and with other people that I bring in to help me, friends, writing buddies. And another thing is the promotion. Like when I first started playing music, I assumed the key was to be really good at music. You would like make a great demo tape where you sounded awesome. And then you would take it to like the best club or bar in town. They would hear the demo tape. They would hear how good you were. They would book you. And then you would get all these fans and you would slowly progress up to bigger and better places. And what I learned was, no, it doesn't matter how good you are. The key is to have an audience. If you can bring 100 friends, don't even have to be fans, like 100 friends to drink at their restaurant or bar. And so I started, handing out flyers and building a mailing list, and all those things, basically promoting the band, are things now. in some way I still am doing those same things on Twitter.
Yeah.
And the I guess the last one that I'll mention, at least here, is overcoming stage fright. You know, when you get up on stage and perform, it can be nerve-wracking. And what I told myself was this thing called wabi-sabi, which is there's actually a King of the Hill episode about it.
Okay.
If you ever watched that cartoon.
Yeah.
But wabi-sabi is basically this, I guess it's like a Zen philosophy where like there are no bad notes. The bad notes are good notes. And I told myself that the key wasn't being perfect. It was about being authentic. And I could do that. And so if I made a mistake, that's just fine, right? And when I started going on TV as a commentator, I adopted some of that same those mental tricks to allow myself to go on TV and not be too nervous about it. And so, as you could see, and I've only touched on like 3 of them, but a lot of that stuff that I was doing that my parents, I'm sure, thought was a waste of time, I was really, in a way, preparing for this life, this career that I now have.
You know, it's funny. I didn't think of it until you just kind of expounded on the relationship between your vocation now and your time as a musician. But when I was first starting out as a young adult, I was a stockbroker during the day, but I was going to this theater conservatory at night, and I saw huge overlaps between 2 very, very different worlds. So the central idea behind method acting is basically there's a lot of different iterations of it, especially in the States. But going back to Stanislavski, it starts with, what is your objective? What is your goal, your character's goal? Objective, what's the action that your character is implementing in order to achieve his objective? And what are the obstacles that are defining the actions? And in the same way, what I was learning on Wall Street, the beginnings of what I was learning about business plans is they're very much the same thing.
Yeah.
The SWOT plans, strength, weakness, opportunity, threat. There's a lot of similarities there, but I digress a bit.
No, stay here for a second.
Okay.
I got a story and then something else. So here's a funny story. So like the way that my big break getting on TV happened because I made friends with there was a driver who used to drive me back and forth to MSNBC, and we would hang out and talk. Like while he was driving me, we became really good friends, and I loaned him this book. It was Manhunt, about the hunt for John Wilkes Booth, and he had it laying on his dash. And Joe Scarborough got in his car and said, "Hey, that's an interesting book." And the guy's like, "Yeah, Matt Lewis loaned that to me. You should have him on." So, so I made friends with these drivers, and there was a different driver, and I'm not gonna do the voice here, but I don't. If you ever watched that show from the '80s called Spencer for Hire.
Oh yeah, yeah.
There was a guy named Hawk on that show who was like a 7-foot tall black man who was super tough.
Yeah.
That was my driver of the car. And I was talking to him one day, and this was right after Heath Ledger died.
Okay.
And I was telling him how, like, I think maybe, Heath Ledger was, like, really immersed in being the Joker. And that it might have led him to go crazy. And I started talking to the driver, and I was telling him, like, do you know about what's the acting called that you were doing? Method acting?
Method acting, yeah.
And I was like, have you ever heard of this? And he was like, acted like he was unfamiliar with it. And then he goes, "Oh, you mean like Leo Strasberg?"
Yeah.
Well, it's unbelievable how smart and well-read. It was just amazing conversations we had.
Yeah.
But, I remember hearing Tim Keller one time talk about, he had someone come in, being a preacher in New York City was an interesting and challenging thing for him coming. I think he was coming from Virginia. And he had someone come in and say, like, I'm an actor and I'm wondering if this conflicts with being a Christian. And Tim Keller was like, I don't think so. And then the guy said, well, I'm a method actor, and so I'm playing a murderer. And that means I'm basically going to be a murderer for the next year. Does that conflict with being a Christian? And Tim Keller actually never, I don't think, resolved the answer to that, but I found it to be a really interesting conundrum. So let me ask you. I've been wondering about this for a long time.
Sure.
I imagine that if you are really committed to becoming somebody and they're a bad person, that would impact your life.
You know, it's interesting. This never came up on this podcast yet, but I ran what's called a theater and film ministry for a pretty big church here in Santa Clarita. And we ended up we were really just more of a repertory company, and we would do classical theater. We shot some short films. And as a ministry, as a Christian ministry, we often grappled with this stuff. I remember the first time, every once in a while, I would actually get up there on the boards. I was more of an artistic director and producer, but every once in a while, I'd get up there on the boards, and we were doing Oscar Wilde's, oh gosh, what was the name of that play? Not The Importance, Woman of No Importance. And I played he was a real cad. He was a fun character to play, but he did some awful things and really was just terribly manipulative to a destructive degree. That part didn't mess me up because I could simply defer to the portrayal of the character and keep some separation there. But there are I think you just have to know yourself as an artist. You just have to know what your limitations are and take a breath. So for me, I have a little bit more of a proclivity. I'm a passionate romantic, you know? So, and not so coincidentally, it wasn't the portrayal of this cad of a character. It was the fact at one point he kissed one of the main characters, the woman, and they actually kissed. That became much more of a scandal. The fact that these two actors playing characters that were members of the church actually kissed. I'm like, Are you kidding me? But on a serious note, I would have to, when I was studying, you know, once I was married and stuff, and Lisa and I were going together before that, I had to know what my limitations were. You know, I did Dangerous Liaisons once. And that guy, Vicomte de Valmont, he started getting into it was messing with my head. So to the extent that I was feeling feelings of attraction to one of the women that I was playing with, and I just had to know my limitations and kind of back off.
But is that method acting? Like if you're really committed to the method acting formula, like haven't you kind of given up the ability to?
No. There's this great there's a great moment between Laurence Olivier and Dustin Hoffman, and it was for that I forgot the name of the movie where Olivier is playing the dentist and he's torturing Hoffman, and Hoffman prepared for it. He's a Strasberg student. He prepared for it by like starving himself for 3 days and running around the building 10 times to tire himself out. And he comes in and he's all distraught and sweating, and Olivier asks, "What's wrong with you? You look terrible." And he says what he was doing to prepare for the scene where he's about to get tortured. And Olivier's response was, "My boy, why don't you try acting?" You know? So I do think that there is, I think that Strasberg School and a lot of actors that went through that training, they tended to go down that road a little bit more, where they took things a little bit too literally. I studied a little bit more with Stella Adler's technique and Meisner. There was a great rift between those guys who started out with the group theater, and Stella was much more about the imagination. So, you know, guys like Brando, Robert Duvall, Robert De Niro, I think they didn't have some of those frailties, if you will, that people like James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, Monty Clift. I do think that if you track with their lives, the acting messed them up even more in a way. So I didn't expect that we'd be talking about this.
That's the mark of a good conversation.
Oh, okay. All right. Fair enough. So I did want to ask you, one of the things, again, I really loved Too Dumb to Fail. It wasn't what I was expecting. It was much more of dare I say, an academic treatise. And I got quite an education on the conservative movement going back to Aristotle. So not that you could do this in 30 seconds or less, but I was hoping that you could give us a bit of that history, the formation of conservative thought that you track from Aristotle, I think, to Burke, and then on forward into the 20th century iterations. And if you could give us a little bit of that background.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm prepped to do that. I wrote this book in January. The book came out in January of 2016, which means I wrote it in 2015. First, let me just say, the premise of the book is that conservatism is a serious and thoughtful philosophy, and I believe that it's actually the best for human flourishing. And then my premise is that the Republican Party, who in America is the home of conservatism, the political home of conservatism, over time became corrupted and went down the wrong path. But I felt like I couldn't just start there. It was important to establish the premise that conservatism actually was a serious philosophy, and to sort of explain the history of how this happened, because you hear people all the time say, Donald Trump is a symptom of the problem.
Yeah.
And I actually believe that's true, but the problem didn't start in 2012 either. And so I kind of went through, you noted I sort of start with Aristotle, but I think Edmund Burke is the person I look to as sort of the leader of quote unquote modern conservatism. And I really, I looked to several different books that I wanted to kind of help popularize as I told this story. And one of them is a book by Yuval Levin,
okay,
about Edmund Burke versus Thomas Paine. And I talk about these differing worldviews and how, Burke's worldview is essentially that we live in a fallen world and that man is fallen, but that we have been able to, over time, slowly build civilization, and that it's precious and it's tenuous. And Paine's worldview was different. He believed that we could begin the world over again, and that leads you down the road to things like a belief in the perfectibility of man. And so, if you want to look at some of the worldview differences between the right and the left, Yuval Levin says look to Paine and Burke. So that's an example of one of the things that I start with, starting with Edmund Burke, talking about those philosophical differences, and then I bring it all the way up until modern times. I spend a good bit of time on Ronald Reagan along the way.
Yeah,
he is somebody that I think was actually a very good president and a good person and a good conservative. And that's one of the things that makes me different from some of the people who critique the right. For a lot of them, the last good Republican, if there ever was one, was Dwight Eisenhower. And so you end up with a lot of the criticisms of the right are really progressives who never really liked conservatism. And so I think one of the things that made this book unique, and by the way, I wrote this before. There have been subsequent books. People like Charlie Sykes, for example, wrote a book about like where the right went wrong kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think my book was kind of, maybe the first attempt, at least in the Trump era, to write that kind of book and to tell that story. And to be honest, I'm really proud of it. I think it's really held up well. And it was great because I'm a columnist and I write all these 750 word columns about what's happening right this minute.
Yeah.
It was really fun to get to go a little deeper and to talk about ideas and history and philosophy a little more than I do on an average day.
Well, it was interesting to look at that and understand that it was, it was published early in 2016, paperback coming out not until spring of that year. So I knew that you were writing it in 2015. But some of what you discussed, I forget if it was, some of the stuff was in the book, but some of it was in columns that you were writing at that time. But how on the money some of those things were. For example, you were taking Donald Trump much more seriously as a possibility, not only to win the nomination, but to win the election. And specifically, I think it was, again, it might have been in a column that you wrote at about the same time, but you specifically said the 3 states because of the Rust Belt and that he was speaking uniquely to a population that could swing Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But there are some other things that I think you might have been off base. So
Well, I mean, and one thing is, place where I was clearly off base is I thought Trump would lose the general election, even though I was cautioning people like, hey, he might win. He's got a better chance than you think.
yeah,
At the end of the day, if push came to shove and I was forced to bet, I thought Hillary would probably win. I didn't think people took Trump seriously enough, but I also thought, I just don't know how Trump wins. I don't know how Trump overcomes Philadelphia, for
Yeah.
example. I just think, Pennsylvania is always fool's gold.
yeah.
Republicans always think they're going to win Pennsylvania. There's this Philadelphia machine. Like, I just don't see it. And that, so I ended up being ultimately wrong about that. But I think I was probably, why don't you go ahead? Because I'm sure I was wrong about a lot of other stuff too.
No, it's more of a larger conversation, and it's actually one of the things that you address in the book is, can the conservative movement reckon with where we've gotten it wrong? And your description of conservative thought, I very much identify with, but I hadn't heard it. Before I started this project and reading Charlie Sykes' book or Bill Kristol's parents' essays from the late 40s and into the 50s, I knew that I had some issues where I fell more conservative, but from a philosophical standpoint, it just made a heck of a lot more sense. But I'll give you one specific thing. I think your wife does a fundraiser in Paul Weyrich's name, right?
Yep.
Do I have that? So
Yeah, it still does.
interestingly, just last week, I had a conversation with someone, great scholar, theologian, who you would probably identify as very, very progressive. And in one of her books, she tracks with Paul Weyrich's association with Jerry Falwell, Bob Jones Jr., and how the moral majority was actually a direct outworking of Bob Jones Jr.'s, in particular, segregationist tendencies. So I was going to ask you about that, but more broadly, like, is the conservative movement able to reckon with where we've gotten it wrong? And you in particular, for example, your collection of Sarah Palin's, what she said in public and speeches and stuff like that, a specific issue like that, how you've evolved on your view of certain leaders or certain ideas, reckoned with where you in particular have gotten it wrong.
Yeah. So I would say that generally speaking, I have not changed, generally speaking, but that everybody else has.
You're going with Reagan right now, aren't you?
It is kind of like Reagan. I didn't leave the party; they left me.
Yeah.
It's basically what has happened. I think that, for example, let's say like Russia would be an example of where like I still don't like Putin, I still don't trust Putin. The Republican Party when I was a kid was very tough on Russia. And now that has changed. Well, I haven't changed. They have changed. And that's like just one of many examples. Having said that, you can't be in this business where you're like putting out opinions and all the time and not get some things wrong. And I think like Sarah Palin in general is something that I got wrong. So I was a big booster of Palin's back in 2008. Like I thought it was great that McCain picked her, and I'm not too hard on myself because I still understand why he picked her. Yeah. And I will say, she was great when he announced her. She gave a great speech at the convention, and she held her own in a debate against Joe Biden. So if you had told me like she's going to do those three things, we're going to pick a running mate who's going to have a great rollout, give a great speech at the convention, and do well during the debate, I would have said, okay, that's a win. I think that Palin ended up becoming really radicalized. And I think the question is whether, was she always a flawed vessel, or was she just thrown in the deep end too quickly and became radicalized by the media scrutiny, which I do think was unfair? And I think I've come to the conclusion that both things are true. I think that it might have been possible for Palin to have been mentored and brought along slowly and to have matured into a better public servant. Like in a different environment, maybe she would have gone from being governor of Alaska to being a U.S. senator, and she might have been fine. However, it is clear to me that she had character flaws and deficiencies, and that she was very indicative of the right, the populist right these days. And so I think that was an area where I was like rooting on this person that ended up becoming kind of the forerunner to Donald Trump.
Yeah. She was such a symbol of what was happening at that moment. And again, she was a reflection of what was already happening for several years. Now, it was cool to go through that collection because it was clarifying. You know, when you read things in their context that she said, whether it was interviews or speeches, it made more sense. And she actually had a decently thought out point of view on anything from gay marriage to abortion, tax, foreign policy, you know, and she wasn't, everybody knows she wasn't always fairly treated or even accurately represented what she said. But I would say that a lot of folks that I really love and respect were big fans of hers, but they had to overlook certain primary qualities of hers and the primary impacts that she was having or exacerbating. And to me, what I was really intrigued when they first announced her, because I love the idea, number one, of a woman on the big ticket, but number two, specifically a woman who bucked her own party in her own state with executive experience. So that stuff on the back of her baseball card was appealing to me. But literally within a few minutes, the first time I heard her speak, what I was hearing was specifically how she was engaging. She couldn't utter one sentence without basically demonizing anyone who was associated with, quote unquote, the other side. And I thought that's just and now that's just you know, Donald Trump obviously took that to a whole other level. Everything is, if you're not with us, you're against us, you're the enemy, and everything is through the prism of a fight, and we got to defeat you. And that's how I think a lot of folks can justify, people I go to church with can justify someone who, like Trump, who embodies the exact opposite of the fruit of the spirit, you know?
Another area where the party's left me. I mean,
yeah.
But no, with Palin, this is all, you know, looking back and probably having rationalized it, but my thinking was, okay, so she's going to balance the ticket. You've got John McCain, who's the statesman. He's obviously going to be at the top of the ticket. So Palin will come in, and traditionally the role of the running mate and the vice president has been to be a bit of an attack dog. I mean, that sort of was the role, and John McCain could be above the fray, and Palin could be in there mixing it up, that they would complement each other, and that some of this was shtick.
Yeah.
But in hindsight, you know, looking back, so I don't know if you know Kathleen Parker of the Washington Post.
I love her. The Washington Post. Yeah, love her.
Yeah, so I used to criticize her a lot because she was at the Washington Post at the time, and fairly early on, she wrote a column basically saying, like, you know, McCain should drop her from the ticket.
Yeah.
And I saw that as, you know, apostasy, as just a stab in the back from someone who ought to be on our quote unquote team. And in hindsight, I've looked at it and thought, well, that was really unfair of me, that, you know, Kathleen perhaps saw something in Palin that I didn't see at the time.
Yeah. There were a number of then pure conservative writers and thinkers, most of whom now are like ostracized from the Republican fold as we know it now. But, you know, I was going to ask you about that. So we have a wide array of folks like David French, Jonah Goldberg, Peggy Noonan, George Will, or elected official Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger. I wonder if the cancer of Trumpism is fatal to the conservative movement or the Republican Party, or have the weeds so overtaken the wheat that there really is no separating them at this point. You accounted for one moment when William F. Buckley was able to evolve on civil rights. And then he also had the credibility to call out the John Birch Society when he had to. I wonder if there's any going back, if there's any William F. Buckley who can say, look, this is this is not us. This is not conservative. Is there any retrieving any of that?
So I think if there was one person who might have been able to do it, I think it would have been Rush Limbaugh. And he chose not to do it. In fact, he did the opposite. The problem, though, is that technology has changed. So, in other words, Bill Buckley wasn't just able to call out the toxic forces on the right, not just solely by virtue of his moral authority, but also by virtue of the fact that he had a printing press. You couldn't just start a magazine. It was hard. I mean, you could, but you probably had to have millions of dollars. And so the masses out there could not compete with Buckley and his magazine. And he was a gatekeeper. He could effectively shut people out. If go to human events. I don't know. There were 2 or 3 places you could have gone if you wanted to be a prominent conservative. Start a newsletter like Phyllis Schlafly or something, maybe. But nowadays, anyone can get the word out. And so the dynamic has changed. So it is incredibly hard for any one leader to kind of say, okay, this stops now. We're not doing this now. And again, I think it might have been possible if at the right moment, Rush Limbaugh had done it. He didn't do it. And it might not have even worked for him. He might have just become obsolete and irrelevant. I mean, that's how powerful this force is. But technology, I think, has really made it difficult.
That's an interesting point. I didn't think of it that way. For as powerful and influential as someone like Tucker Carlson, who I want to ask you about in a second, seem their percentage of market share is considerably less than folks in the past. His viewership is in the single digit millions, whereas others might have garnered a much higher percentage of, say, conservative readers like Buckley did. So I did want to ask you about Tucker. So you worked for the Daily Caller, which was co-founded by Tucker Carlson. And I think just as pretty recently, you still would consider him a friend, I heard you say. I was curious if the Tucker Carlson we see on TV every night, the Tucker Carlson who made this, what was it called? Patriot Purge, this documentary supposedly about, it's been, widely discussed, but is that just a character he's playing on TV or is it like a Jekyll and Hyde thing? He's permanently turned into this other Mr. Hyde.
I wish I could give you more insight. It's funny. About a month ago, I went to this meeting with a whole bunch of prominent conservative writers, and literally the biggest topic of conversation everywhere I went was, what happened to Tucker Carlson? And these are people who knew him even better than I did, and in some cases who were more colleagues of his. I was an underling, although he never treated me like an underling. I mean, that's the thing about Tucker, is when you worked for him, he treated you like you were the president of the company. You could be the lowliest intern, and he would treat you the same as he would anyone else. So, my personal experience with Tucker was fabulous. He was a great boss, and even when I was writing things Too Dumb to Fail, I write in 2015, but I started working for Tucker, I think in January of 2011, something like that. So I had written these themes for 4 or 5 years that became the book. Most of the stuff that became Too Dumb to Fail were ideas that I had hashed out in columns and blog posts on the Daily Caller and other places. And Tucker paid me to write things that go very much against what he believes and even believed back then. The one thing I can tell you is that he did not change to be more like Trump. That he was, when I was working for him as far back as 2011, he was much more populist and nationalist than I was. And people think that he changed because 25 years ago, he was a libertarian and he was writing pieces for the Wall Street Journal saying we should have more immigrants. So he did change over time, but well before Trump came along, he had become much more populist and nationalist. I'm a little bit sad. About a week ago, a guy named John Ward, who John worked at the Daily Caller and literally left the week I came in, and I took his office. So I worked for 6 years in the office that had been his for like a year and a half or 2 years. And he worked for Tucker at the Daily Caller, and he just wrote a piece critical of the Patriot Purge for Yahoo. And Tucker did a segment on the show attacking him. And that really hurt me. And I was talking to some of my other friends and colleagues. We still stay in touch. And a lot of people are very upset and hurt because this is a really special work environment. Like, it was very tight-knit and very close. And there was a tremendous amount of friendship and respect there. Obviously, the bigger story is like the impact that Tucker has on the country. But there's like a subplot about, people who used to work together at this place and, who are grappling with whether they can continue to, should they speak out publicly against him and that kind of thing. I've really tried to, in fact, I just wrote a piece the other day where I was critical of some of the things he's espousing, but really try not to make it personal because, again, I really like Tucker, and I have to say, like, he was one of the best bosses I've ever had in my life.
There was a column that you wrote about a week or so ago. Conservatives flying freak flags embrace being the villain. Yeah. And part of what you were talking about, and I wonder if some folks just made a conscious decision, like, no, this is now war. You describe an environment at the Daily Caller where you have folks of diverse range of opinions, folks who went on to Breitbart, folks who went on to more left-leaning publications, and all not just operating under the same roof, but really collaborating and having lively dialogue with each other. But in this piece that you wrote a week or so ago, you describe an environment that's very, very different. And I wonder if there are some folks who, again, just consciously made up their mind that this is war. And in war, all rules have to be thrown out the window,
I think that's fundamentally what it is. I mean, I think that is exactly right. And I think you've put it very well. Once you buy into that analogy or that concept, then everything is justified. It's like the just war theory, It's not murder if it happens on the battlefield. Well, if politics is the battlefield, then all's fair.
Right. And that's how good Christians, quote unquote, can justify someone like Donald Trump, where it's funny, I say sort of offhandedly, but it's pretty close to serious that I can open up pretty much any page of the Bible and it testifies against the words, actions, and character of Donald John Trump. Yeah.
It's been funny for me. I mean, I've been sitting in a pew hearing, preachers who support Trump preach, and everything they're saying is against Donald Trump without saying his name. It's a weird thing.
Yeah. But again, it's justified. And his marketing, part of his marketing strategy in 2020 was really effective. And it's something that I hear other politicians. I got a letter from our Congressman, Mike Garcia, and he just basically adapted the same line, which was fighting for you. We're fighting for you. The fact that, we're identifying a certain way and we feel like we're in a war and we need somebody to fight for us, that definitely resonates with a huge section of the populace. I just don't think it's reflective of reality.
Yeah. And I think some of that goes back to Andrew Breitbart. I mean, I remember like the war hashtag, for example. And Andrew Breitbart's someone, I don't know if you ever met him. I knew him a little bit, really liked him, very nice guy. But I think that he would not have liked Donald Trump, at least not initially. I'm confident of that. But he is someone who I think basically looked to, the left and like Saul Alinsky and tried to ape the evil, horrible things they were doing and replicate it or learn from it which is fine to learn from it, but to mimic it. And I think that I don't want to say he's entirely responsible, but I think he was certainly part of pushing that politics is war mentality. And honestly, that's how you get civil war, right? I mean, that is a civil war at some point.
So a whole section of your book is really a prescription of how do we get out of this? I wonder if you were to write a follow-up to that book, what are some of the ways that you think, is there a way out of this, or is it going to get a lot worse before it gets better? Or is it just too simple of a question to ask? It's just not that simple. But I guess the main question being, how do we find our way out of this?
It is super complicated. And I would say a lot harder than when I wrote it. Like when I wrote it, it was hard to prescribe a solution. And I think it would be much harder now, 5 years later. I can just tell you what I've done, or what I try to do is not think about the problem from a global standpoint, but think about it as an individual, and just try to, like, irrespective of what everybody else is saying, I'm going to do these things. I'm going to, live this life. I'm going to stand for these principles and these values. And if enough people follow me or replicate what I'm doing, then we will have a critical mass. I'll just say one thing, and again, so the hard part is this requires individuals making choices. But the first thing they ought to do is turn off cable TV.
Oh, baby.
It's incredibly toxic. It's incredibly damaging. I basically watch a little Morning Joe, and I watch Special Report. And that's pretty much it. And I think that if you're watching a lot of cable TV, that is not good for you or the country.
Would you say the same thing about a lot of AM radio or XM radio now? Like the Patriot channel on XM or something like that?
Oh, I'm sure. I wasn't even thinking about it because I don't listen to much of it. I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh sometimes in the car just to kind of, for old time's sake. I used to be a huge Rush fan. My dad introduced me to Rush's show like in 1988.
Wow. Okay.
I used to listen all the time. And like, dude, there are times like if Rush Limbaugh had died like in 1990 or even 1998 maybe, I would have really felt like a member of my family had died. It would have been devastating. But I'm just a big podcast fan now. So yeah. I think that podcasting is, knock on wood, I'm sure that the suits are going to find a way to pervert it and ruin the platform. But for now, I would say that podcasting is perhaps the only net positive technological development in communications in the last decade. I mean, as much as I love my iPhone, I would love to throw it in the ocean if I could. But I think that podcasting is really a net positive. And so I would, but again, hey, it's garbage in, garbage out. If you're listening to like Steve Bannon's podcast all day long, that's not necessarily a good thing.
Well, my diet is definitely a lot of Matt Lewis in the news, Ron Steslow's Politicology, definitely the Dispatch. And there's several titles on the Dispatch. Jonah has one of his own, the Good Faith podcast, as well as the main one. And then I've learned so much about the law and the conservative legal movement from the one that David and Sarah Isgur do together, Advisory Opinions, and Charlie Sykes is the Bulwark. There's so much good stuff on there that's really intelligent commentary, intelligent conversations. But yeah, I mean, if your diet is more Dan Bongino than David French, it's it's the Isn't
it amazing that we used to be under the same umbrella and the same movement, that like we all used to, and some of the people used to like really happily coexist in the sense of like, I mean, not happily, but like Bill Kristol and Laura Ingraham probably went to cocktail parties together. You know what I mean? That's just.
So did Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So.
Yeah, that's true. But again, I used to work with Tucker, and so I mean, it's
that's what makes me wonder, is because I know that a lot of folks had really healthy dialogue, but some folks chose this Trumpian road. And it's not just about Donald Trump. It's just the symbol of what it's all about, what it means in our culture. I did want, before we got to wrap up pretty soon here, but I did want to ask you before we wrap it up about your own conservative roots. So you mentioned being introduced to Rush Limbaugh by your dad in the late 80s. Was it Rush Limbaugh or you went to the Leadership Institute, I think?
Yeah.
How did you really form your convictions as a conservative? How did you learn about the movement and begin to understand what it was all about?
It was a long process. I was not an intellectual. I'm still not. But I mean, like, I started off listening to Rush Limbaugh, watching Family Ties with Alex P. Keaton, loving Ronald Reagan, and being like really just a in the gut conservative, you know? Taxes are bad. We need to beat Russia. We need to have a strong national defense. We need law and order. My dad's a prison guard. So actually the young Matt Lewis would have probably had an even better handle on Donald Trump. In fact, I wonder, my dad died in 2004, and my mom and I have lunch every week, and one of our frequent conversations is whether Dad would have been a Trump fan or not. We both fear that he would have eventually become one, but we're not sure. So I was not immersed I wasn't reading National Review, for example, or the Weekly Standard or anything like that. And then I went to college and I became a political science major only because it was the only way I could graduate. And I'm not joking. I started off as an education major. I like to teach. But it was sort of too, I don't know, squishy progressive for me. You know how it is. And so I switched to history, but I couldn't, even though I love Spanish and I love trying to learn Spanish, I kept failing Spanish. And the only way I could, but I was dating a girl at the time who figured out, because she was good at, I didn't know anything about the bureaucracy. She figured out that if I became a political science major, for some reason, don't ask me why, I would not need a foreign language.
Oh, wow.
So I became a political science major and really just excelled in those classes without really trying. But I never volunteered on a campaign. I never interned anywhere. I never did any extracurricular activity, nothing, zero. And I graduated, and the only job I could get was working at a Roy Rogers fast food restaurant. By the way, I was a manager, and I don't want to knock them. They were great, and I still like their food. But it wasn't probably what I hoped for when I went to college with these grand ambitions, being a rock star or something.
Yeah.
But I started working on a campaign for a guy running for state senate, and he said, if you want to be my manager, you have to go to this place called the Leadership Institute.
Oh, okay.
They'll teach you how to do it right. So I went there. We won the race. I ended up interning at the Leadership Institute, and I ended up working there for 4 years. And during that time, primarily what I was focused on was teaching people how to win elections and how to run campaigns. But Morton Blackwell, who runs the Leadership Institute, is also very interested in making sure that people have a sound philosophical grounding. And so he has, for example, this booklet he wrote called Read to Lead. And when you're an intern there, you basically read all the books. And at the end of the internship, he gives you like $250. Back then, it's probably more now. And you could go to Amazon and order any book that you wanted, as long as it was somehow in the world of politics. And you would get all of these classic books from like the conservative canon, like Russell Kirk, Richard Weaver, William F. Buckley, things like that. And that's what opened the door to me starting to learn about conservative philosophy. And the irony is that all the things that I was starting to learn and develop, like a coherent belief system, all of those things ironically backfired. Because when Donald Trump came along, they were all out, they actually hurt me in terms of getting ahead in the conservative movement, at least.
Oh, man.
Having a strong foundation in conservative philosophy was only a negative in the Trump era.
Yeah.
In terms of being a part of that movement.
Yeah, again, like the book is really worth reading. I'm not just saying this because you're on, but I really, there are so many things that you touched on. We didn't even get into too much of the Christian parts of it, and the dumbification of the conservative movement, and the dumbification of evangelicalism. There's so much more to talk about, but I guess that means we have to talk again.
Yeah. and Mark Knoll was one of, I mentioned earlier that I really looked at like maybe 4 or 5 books that a lot of people had maybe forgotten or hadn't read. And I brought them back. And one of the books that really helped me with Too Dumb to Fail was Mark Knoll's book about the scandal of the evangelical mind.
Yeah.
And there was some Richard Hofstadter in there. There was some Rod Dreher in there. There was some Amusing Ourselves to Death. There were like maybe 5 books that really as I'm writing Too Dumb to Fail, these books were really helping inform me. But the scandal of the evangelical mind was definitely one of them.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have to reckon through a lot of that, because I came to be a Christian later in life, 29 years old, after much thought and philosophical grappling and theological grappling. And I had to start grappling with my theological convictions pretty early on, because some of the discrepancies that I saw in who we were as a people, like in praxis, versus what I was reading in scripture. So those questions started becoming prominent in my own thoughts and formation as a Christian. It's only been heightened over these last 5 or 6 years. But again, that's for another conversation. So before we wrap up, you get to ask me a question or two.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna take it down a little bit.
Okay.
From the intellectual heights and get some really practical advice. So I haven't had a proper haircut since COVID. And it's interesting how much feedback I get from people who hate it, who hate the way it looks. But I noticed you have some long locks as well, and I'm wondering if you have any advice on whether it's dealing with the haters or whether it's just the care and maintenance. You know, what kind of conditioner a person ought to use at this point. Because I never, even though I played in rock bands, like my hair was never this. It's never been this long in my life. So I'm breaking new ground here.
So I grew it this long once before. I was in my early to mid 20s when I first moved out to California. But at that time, I couldn't afford conditioner. I could afford like the combo shampoo and conditioner in one.
Pert.
Yeah,
Pert.
There you go.
I don't know what's the combination?
I have no idea.
I don't
remember.
Know.
But my hair was all kinds of scraggly. It didn't. The only reason I grew it out is because I have this like frizzy hair that just kind of grows out. So I grew it long so that I could tie it back like I'm doing right now. So, but now we can afford.
That's kind of the state I'm in, man.
I know you have to. So you're still kind of at the end of what I call like the junior high school phase. It's like just weird and hasn't figured itself out yet. So you'll get past it though. You'll get into high school and start becoming cool again. But here's a couple of secrets.
It's not quite long enough that I can really, completely do the man bun.
No.
But at this point, the more negative feedback I get, it's remember when Trump? I will say this about Trump: he's funny, and you remember like people would criticize Trump and it'd be like, the wall just got higher.
Yeah.
And someone would say something bad, he's like, the wall just got 6 inches taller.
Yeah. That's
how I am. It's like every time I hear negative feedback, I'm like, the hair just got another inch longer.
Yeah, that's kind of my mindset about it. It's like the length of my hair doesn't submit itself to a democratic process.
Yeah.
Well,
the other thing too is, I think this is a lesson that's very important for people to understand. I will not take advice. I will not take criticism from someone unless I admire, like, if you're someone who's like a style icon to me, like, and you tell me it looks bad, okay, then I will believe you. But if you're not, then and so in other words, instead of just accepting negative feedback and letting it hurt you or make you decide to change, consider, do you want to look like the person who's giving you this advice? Like, do you trust are they the style guru that you want to trust?
Right. Yeah. So for me, the key is if I think it's going to be a turn on for my wife, then she can say whatever she wants,
Yes.
and that has a lot of sway.
If my wife didn't like my hair, it would have been, well, it wouldn't have been this long. It would be cut in an instant.
Exactly.
I would be Samson to her Delilah.
So, but I will say this. So a couple things. One is, believe it or not, don't wash it every day because it tends to dry out your hair. But I do think mixing it up, if you have a couple different shampoos and conditioners, that helps. And then every once in a while, I'll do the shampoo, but then we have this coconut oil. So I'll just like, instead of doing conditioner, I'll come out of the shower, dry my hair, and put some, I can't believe we're talking about this.
Gives it some, some moisture.
Yeah, you have to moisturize your hair. So that definitely
Like
helps. So
You're listening to Hair Talk?
yeah.
Listen to the Hair Talk, 103.2.
There you go.
No, this is helpful.
Okay,
this
good.
is helpful.
Good.
There aren't a lot of people I could turn to at this point for advice.
So glad I could help. All right. If there are no other questions about my grooming habits, if you could let us know how we could find you online, your writing, your awesome podcast, Matt Lewis and the News, how can we find you?
Yeah. Well, and first, let me just thank you for having me. And I have to say, because I write 3 times a week, not everything I write is great. But I am really proud of the book, Too Dumb to Fail.
Yeah.
And it's really held up. Like, sometimes you'll write something, you'll think it's good, and then you'll look at it like a year later, and you're like, no, that sucks. But the book I'm really proud of. And so thank you for reading it and spending time talking about it. And I hope people will get it. But you can read me at The Daily Beast and follow me at Matt K. Lewis on Twitter. And then you mentioned my podcast. That's really a labor of love. That's the really fun thing that I do, is interviewing and talking to people like you. And it's called Matt Lewis and the News. Check that out.
Yeah. There's really, aside from yours truly, there's really a lineup of great guests, and you get into these awesome conversations. So I've become a bit of a student of yours, just studying how you engage with folks and the substantive conversations that you get into. It's entertaining, but it's also edifying. So I give you a lot of props there.
Thank you. I love doing it. And I have no idea how I do it. Like, in terms of, if there's a method to my interviewing, I do not know what it is. Like, there is no thought through process. I hope it's good.
No, it's great. You do intuitively, I guess, it takes me like hours and hours of research and reading and preparation and listening to podcasts to get ready for one conversation. And then it must be like an OCD thing that's clicking in me, because then I'll do the editing, and I can't get through editing. It's usually, at least if there's an hour of conversation, it's at least 3 to 5 hours of editing for me.
Yeah.
So I have to figure out how to economize my time, both in preparation as well as post. But if I have the time to do a good one, then I have yet to regret the amount of prep that I do, because it's always something that's worth learning. So many of these conversations with you, with Bill Kristol, with Ron Steslow, with people who are part of the Trump administration, Elizabeth Newman and Dave LePan, and just so many people are so interesting to learn about. Yeah. So it's been great. Okay, so I have like this list of things that I need to ask you about in future conversations. So we'll save that.
Let's do it.
Yeah. And as always, if you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, leave us a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts, and most importantly, tell a friend about us. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week. Thank you for joining us today. If you're interested in following us, there are a number of ways you can do that. You can go to our site, politicsandreligion.podbean.com. That's politicsandreligion.podbean.com. And we're on all the socials, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at TPNR Pod. Again, at TPANDR Pod, at TPNR Pod. And in the coming weeks, we'll be launching a membership program with all kinds of exciting extras for those who join our community. But mostly, we just really appreciate you giving us a listen. So for all of us here at Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, thanks for visiting with us. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.